Everyone in the Oakmont Hills neighborhood knew one rule: stay away from Rocco. The Mafia boss's 150-pound black mastiff had hospitalized trainers, shattered reinforced leashes, and once tore the bumper clean off a Mercedes that parked too close to his owner's driveway. No one could walk him without risking their life. Not the armed guards, not the professional handlers, not even Richard Banks himself. So when a blonde 8-year-old girl stepped directly into the dog's path on a quiet summer afternoon, every witness held their breath. Rocco's head snapped toward her. His growl deepened into something primal. The elderly couple across the street screamed for her to run. Richard yanked hard on the chain, his knuckles white, his voice sharp with warning. But Kristen Haley didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply knelt on the perfectly manicured grass and whispered something no one else could hear. Rocco's snarl caught in his throat. His massive body went rigid. And then, in a moment that made seasoned criminals and soccer moms alike step back in disbelief, the beast everyone feared slowly walked forward and lowered his enormous head into her tiny hands. Richard Banks stood frozen on the sidewalk, his tattooed chest visible beneath his half-buttoned designer shirt. He'd controlled drug routes, eliminated rivals, and built an empire on calculated violence. But he had never seen his dog obey anyone, especially not a child. What happened next would unravel a secret buried in Rocco's brutal past and force Richard to question everything he believed about power, loyalty, and control. Before we continue, if stories about unexpected connections and second chances resonate with you, you're in the right place. Subscribe and join a community that believes the most powerful transformations happen when we least expect them. Now, let me tell you about the empire Richard built while his neighbors had no idea who he really was. The Banks estate occupied the corner lot of Oakmont Hill's most exclusive street, a pristine suburban fortress disguised as family luxury. Behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and sensor-equipped gates sat a sprawling property where marble countertops gleamed under designer lighting, and surveillance cameras tracked every shadow that moved across the lawn. To the neighbors, Richard Banks was simply the quiet, well-dressed man who drove expensive cars and kept to himself. They didn't know about the warehouse network across 3 states. They didn't know about the offshore accounts or the politicians who returned his calls within minutes. They didn't know that the man who waved politely at block parties had built an empire on fear that stretched from Chicago to Kansas City. But everyone knew about Rocco. The colossal black mastiff had arrived 3 years earlier, a gift from an associate who thought Richard needed better security. From the moment Rocco's paws hit the driveway, it became clear this was no ordinary guard dog. The first trainer lasted 38 minutes before Rocco cornered him against the garage, snarling with such raw violence that the man scrambled onto the roof of Richard's Range Rover and refused to come down until Richard's men brought a ladder. The second trainer made it through 1 session before Rocco snapped a titanium-reinforced leash like thread and chased him 3 blocks down the street. By the time the 4th trainer quit after Rocco shattered a steel feeding bowl with his jaws, the word had spread through underground channels. The dog wasn't just aggressive, he was damaged beyond repair. Rocco destroyed furniture, lunged at passing vehicles, and once nearly killed 2 men who tried to break into Richard's property. His bark rattled windows. His growl made grown men reconsider their life choices. Even Richard kept a cautious distance. The crime boss had tried everything. Veterinary sedatives that barely dulled Rocco's edge, shock collars the dog learned to ignore, and behavioral specialists who charged triple fees only to walk away shaking their heads within 48 hours. Nothing worked. Rocco lived like a warlord in his own territory, patrolling the backyard with an intensity that made the entire neighborhood nervous. Dog walkers crossed to the opposite sidewalk when they saw Richard coming. Parents warned their children never to approach the black gate. Delivery drivers left packages at the curb rather than risk walking up the driveway. The dog had become Richard's greatest vulnerability. Here was a man who could orchestrate million-dollar operations with a single phone call, who commanded absolute loyalty from hardened criminals, who had eliminated threats most people couldn't imagine. Yet he couldn't control one traumatized mastiff. But Richard refused to get rid of Rocco. Beneath the ruthless exterior, something in the dog's untamed fury resonated with him. A refusal to submit, a raw survival instinct, an absolute unwillingness to bow to anyone. Rocco might be unmanageable, but he was also fearless, unpredictable, and brutally honest in his violence. In a strange way, Richard understood that. So Rocco stayed, a 150-pound reminder that even the most powerful men had limits. Richard's security team adapted around the threat. Marcus, the head of operations, installed motion sensors around the backyard perimeter, not to detect intruders, but to track Rocco's movements, so staff could avoid him. The housekeeper left food at the back door rather than entering Rocco's domain. The groundskeepers maintained every inch of the property except the rear corner where Rocco spent most of his time. Even Richard's most trusted enforcers, Men who'd handled interrogations and executions without hesitation gave the dog a wide berth. Rocco had effectively carved out his own untouchable kingdom within Richard Banks's empire, a territory ruled by trauma, rage, and a past no one understood. Until the afternoon, Kristen Haley knelt on the grass and everything changed. That night, Richard stood in his study nursing a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The little girl kneeling, Rocco's rage evaporating like smoke, the impossible surrender. He'd seen men crack under interrogation, watched rivals collapse when their empires crumbled, witnessed loyalty bought, sold, and destroyed. But in 15 years of running the most profitable criminal network in the Midwest, he'd never seen anything like what happened on his front lawn. Richard Banks had built his reputation on control. By day, he was the polished neighbor who attended homeowner association meetings and donated generously to the elementary school fundraiser. He drove his daughter to soccer practice in a Tesla, exchanged pleasantries with the mailman, and hired local teenagers to mow his lawn, the perfect suburban facade. By night, he orchestrated operations that moved product through 7 states, laundered money through a network of legitimate businesses, and maintained relationships with politicians who depended on his financial support to win elections. His word could greenlight shipments worth millions or end careers with a single phone call. His silence had buried investigations. His reach extended into courtrooms, police departments, and corporate boardrooms. Men twice his size walked carefully around Richard Banks. Experienced criminals lowered their voices when discussing him. Even his closest lieutenants understood that loyalty was rewarded generously and betrayal was eliminated permanently. Yet Rocco remained his one glaring weakness. The memory of that third trainer still made Richard wince. The man, a former military K-9 handler with an impressive resume, had lasted exactly 1 session before Rocco cornered him near the tool shed. The handler had actually climbed onto the roof, refusing to come down until Richard's security team arrived with a ladder and a generous severance check. The 5th trainer had been even worse. Mid-session, Rocco had simply looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes, and the man had vaulted the fence like an Olympic athlete, sprinting down the street without looking back. He'd sent his resignation via text message from his car. Richard had stood in the backyard after that disaster, staring at Rocco, who'd returned to his corner like nothing had happened. "I can control men," Richard had said quietly to the Mastiff. "I can control an empire, but I can't control you." Rocco had simply stared back, unmoved. The dog's aggression had only worsened over time. Even at Richard's downtown warehouse, a legitimate shipping facility that handled his less legitimate operations staff members, had learned to fear Rocco as much as they feared the boss himself. The few times Richard had brought the Mastiff to the facility, grown men had pressed themselves against walls, and productivity had ground to a halt. The contrast haunted Richard. His pristine suburban neighborhood with its manicured lawns and block parties existed in a completely different universe from the shadow network he controlled. Soccer moms waved at him while dropping off their kids. Meanwhile, across town, shipments moved through his routes, money changed hands in carefully orchestrated transactions, and problems were solved with methods that would horrify his neighbors. 2 worlds. Perfect separation. Absolute control. Except for Rocco. And now, except for the little girl who'd done in 30 seconds what Richard couldn't accomplish in 3 years. Richard finished the bourbon in 1 swallow, the amber liquid burning down his throat. Outside his study window, Rocco paced the backyard, restless and agitated, as if searching for something he'd lost. Or someone he'd found. 3 houses down from Richard Banks's pristine estate, Kristen Haley sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, sketching a picture she couldn't explain. A large black dog. Bars. Shadows. Her hand moved across the paper almost automatically, filling in details her conscious mind didn't remember, but her fingers somehow knew. The cage. The concrete floor. The way light filtered through a high window she couldn't have possibly seen. "Kristen, honey, dinner's ready." She quickly closed the sketchbook as her adoptive mother, Sarah, appeared in the doorway. The Haleys had moved to Oakmont Hills 8 months earlier, seeking a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood where Kristen could finally feel safe. Sarah had adopted Kristen 4 years ago, after the girl had been rescued from circumstances Sarah still didn't fully understand. The social workers had been vague, mentioning only that Kristen had been found during a police raid and that her early childhood had been complicated. What wasn't complicated was Kristen's gift. The neighbors had noticed it almost immediately. Mrs. Chen's cat, which had been hiding under her porch for 3 days after a thunderstorm, had emerged the moment Kristen sat down and called softly to it. The injured bird that had crashed into the Morrisons' window had calmed in Kristen's hands, allowing her to carefully place it in a box until the wildlife rescue arrived. The incident at the county fair had sealed her reputation. A horse had panicked during a children's riding demonstration, rearing and bucking while parents grabbed their kids and scrambled backward. Kristen had simply walked forward, placed her small hand on the horse's neck, and whispered something the crowd couldn't hear. Within seconds, the animal had settled, its wild eyes softening as it lowered its head toward the little girl. The elderly couple across from Richard's house, the Mitchells, had become particularly fond of her. Kristen visited them twice a week, reading from their favorite books, while Mr. Mitchell listened from his wheelchair and Mrs. Mitchell knitted quietly. They called her their little angel, but angels didn't wake up screaming from nightmares about cages and blood. That evening at dinner, Kristen pushed her mashed potatoes around her plate, her mind still on the massive dog from earlier. "Mom?" she said quietly. The big dog wasn't angry. Sarah looked up from her own plate, concerned. "Honey, Mr. Banks's dog is dangerous. Everyone says so." "But he wasn't angry," Kristen insisted, her gray eyes distant. "He was sad. Really, really sad." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know you have a special way with animals, sweetheart, but that dog has hurt people. I need you to promise me you'll stay away from him, please." Kristen nodded slowly, but even as she made the promise, she felt the pull and invisible thread connecting her to Rocco that she couldn't explain and didn't understand. That night, the dreams came again. Dark spaces, metal bars, the smell of fear and blood. A voice, her own voice, smaller and younger, whispering comfort to something large and hurting in the shadows. And in the dream, just like in real life, the monster had listened. When Kristen woke before dawn, she walked to her window and looked down the street toward Richard Banks's house. Somewhere in that backyard, Rocco was pacing, restless. She could feel it, and somehow, she knew he could feel her too. Rocco didn't sleep that night. The massive mastiff sat motionless by the floor-to-ceiling window in Richard's living room, his dark eyes fixed on the front lawn where the small girl had knelt hours earlier. Moonlight cast silver shadows across the grass, but Rocco wasn't watching the present. He was seeing something else entirely. A concrete floor, slick with blood and filth. Metal bars, cold against his scarred muzzle. Men shouting, their voices harsh and violent, placing bets while dogs tore each other apart in the pit. The memories crashed over him in waves he couldn't control. His massive body tensed, muscles coiling beneath his black coat as the past flooded back with overwhelming clarity. Pain. Always pain. The burning agony of wounds that never fully healed before the next fight. The hollow ache of hunger. The suffocating darkness of the cage they locked him in between matches. He'd learned to survive by becoming the thing they wanted. A monster without mercy. A killer without hesitation. Every instinct screamed violence, because violence meant survival. Trust meant death. But then, Rocco's breathing quickened, his massive chest rising and falling as the memory sharpened. A small figure slipping through the shadows after the men had left. Tiny hands pushing scraps of food through the bars, real food, not the rotten garbage they usually threw at him. A soft voice, barely more than a whisper, speaking words he couldn't understand but recognized as gentle. She came back, night after night, despite the danger, despite the handlers who would beat her if they caught her. She'd press her small face close to the bars and whisper to him, her voice the only softness in his brutal existence. "It's okay," she breathed, her child's voice trembling but determined. "You're not bad. You're just scared. I'm scared too." And for those stolen moments, Rocco hadn't been a weapon. He'd been something else, something he couldn't name but desperately needed. He'd pressed his torn, bleeding face against the bars, as close to her warmth as the cage allowed. She'd reached through the metal, her tiny fingers carefully avoiding his wounds, and touched the only unmarred patch of fur on his head. "Someone will save us," she'd whispered. "Someone has to." Then the raid. Sirens. Shouting. Chaos. The girl's screams as someone pulled her away. The cage door bursting open. Strange hands dragging him toward a van while he fought and snarled, searching desperately for the small voice that had promised salvation. Gone. She was gone. A sound broke from Rocco's throat, low, anguished, unlike anything he'd ever made before. Not a growl, not a bark, a whine, raw with longing and confusion. In the hallway, Richard stopped mid-step, his hand frozen on the banister. He'd been heading upstairs to bed, but that sound, that impossibly vulnerable sound, rooted him in place. He moved quietly to the living room doorway and watched his supposedly savage dog staring out the window with an expression Richard had never seen before. Yearning. Recognition. Something that looked almost like hope. "What is it about her?" Richard whispered, more to himself than to Rocco. But he already knew. Whatever connection Kristen Haley had with Rocco, it wasn't new. It was old, deep, forged in circumstances Richard was only beginning to understand. Rocco remained at the window until dawn broke, his gaze never wavering from the spot where the girl with the gentle voice had knelt, waiting for her to return. It happened 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon when the neighborhood was at its busiest. Richard had made the mistake of attempting another walk. Rocco had been agitated all morning, pacing restlessly, and Richard hoped the exercise might settle him. He'd used the reinforced chain, the thickest one available, and kept a firm grip as they started down the sidewalk. Everything seemed manageable until the two teenage boys rounded the corner on their skateboards. The wheels hit a crack in the pavement. The sharp clatter echoed down the street, and Rocco exploded. The chain ripped through Richard's hands, tearing skin. Before he could brace himself, Rocco launched forward with terrifying speed, 150 pounds of muscle and fury charging directly toward the teens. The boys froze, their faces draining of color. One dropped his skateboard. The other stumbled backward, tripping over the curb. "Run!" someone screamed from across the street. Chaos erupted instantly. Mrs. Chen sprinted toward her house, her groceries scattering across her driveway. Mr. Morrison yanked his toddler out of the front yard. A woman Richard didn't recognize already had her phone out, frantically dialing 911. Richard ran after Rocco, his heart pounding, knowing he'd never reach the dog in time. This was it, the nightmare scenario he'd dreaded for 3 years. Rocco was going to kill someone, and there was nothing Richard could do to stop it. Then Kristen Haley stepped onto the sidewalk. She emerged from the Mitchell's house where she'd been reading, her small figure appearing directly in Rocco's path. The massive mastiff was 10 feet away, then 5, his jaws open, his eyes wild, his momentum unstoppable. "Kristen, no!" Richard roared. But the little girl didn't run. She simply raised one hand, palm out, and spoke a single word Richard couldn't hear over the pounding in his ears. Rocco's paws skidded against the concrete. His massive body twisted awkwardly as he fought his own momentum, struggling to halt mid-charge. He slid to a stop less than 3 feet from Kristen, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on hers. The street went absolutely silent. Kristen lowered her hands slowly and knelt on the sidewalk. "It's okay," she said softly, clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm here. You're safe." Rocco's aggression melted like ice under summer sun. The rigid tension left his muscles. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, slowly lifted. And then, while 24 witnesses watched in stunned disbelief, Rocco moved forward and positioned himself between Kristen and the terrified teenagers, not as a threat, but as a shield. He was protecting her. Richard stopped running, his hands still bleeding from the chain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, neighbors emerged from wherever they'd taken cover, staring at the impossible scene before them. Mrs. Mitchell clutched her husband's wheelchair, her voice barely audible. "That girl has a gift." "She performed magic," the woman with the phone whispered, slowly lowering it without completing the 911 call. Mr. Morrison shook his head slowly. "Or maybe she's the only one the devil dog respects." But Richard knew better. Standing there on the sun-drenched sidewalk, watching Kristen gently stroke Rocco's scarred head while the mastiff remained perfectly still, Richard understood with crystalline clarity. This wasn't magic. This wasn't respect. This wasn't even obedience. This was recognition. Rocco knew her. Had known her long before Richard ever brought him to this quiet suburban neighborhood. And whatever had happened between them, whatever bond had been forged in circumstances Richard could only guess at, it was powerful enough to override years of trauma and violence. Kristen looked up and met Richard's eyes across the distance. Her expression wasn't triumphant or afraid. It was simply knowing, as if she'd been waiting for him to figure it out. Richard made the call from his warehouse office at 2 a.m, when the legitimate shipping business was dark and silent. "I need information," he said without preamble, when the voice on the other end picked up. "About a dogfighting operation that got raided 4 years ago, somewhere in the tri-state area." The contact, a former enforcer who now made his living brokering information, exhaled slowly. "That's a deep dive, Banks. Those rings don't keep records. People involved tend to disappear after raids. Find someone who didn't disappear," Richard said coldly. "I'll make it worth your time." It took 36 hours and $10,000, but the contact delivered. The man's name was Vincent Cole, and he agreed to meet Richard at a truck stop outside the city limits. He was in his 50s, weathered and nervous, with the kind of face that had seen too much and wanted to forget most of it. They sat in a corner booth while Richard slid an envelope across the scarred table. Cole counted the cash quickly, then pocketed it. What do you want to know? A black mastiff, Richard said. Would have been seized from a fighting ring about 4 years ago. Massive, aggressive, scarred. Recognition flickered across Cole's face. Brutus. Yeah, I remember that animal. Most vicious fighter in the circuit. Killed 3 dogs before he was even 2 years old. He paused. You're the one who ended up with him? Tell me about the operation. About him. Cole leaned back, his eyes distant. It was a brutal setup. Underground facility, concrete floors, blood everywhere. We had maybe 15 dogs at any given time. Most didn't last long. He grimaced. Brutus was different. He survived because he learned to be more savage than anything we put him against. But, Richard pressed, sensing there was more. But there was this kid, Cole said quietly. Little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old. She belonged to one of the handlers. Bad situation all around. She'd sneak down to the cages at night when everyone was drunk or passed out. Richard's pulse quickened. What did she do? Fed the dogs, talked to them. She was drawn to Brutus specifically. Maybe because he was the most damaged. I don't know. Kid logic. Cole shook his head. She'd push food through the bars, whispered to him for hours. And that monster? He'd press his face against the cage and just listen. Only time I ever saw him calm. What happened to her? The raid. State police and animal control busted us all at once. They took the dogs, arrested everyone, and child services grabbed the girl. She'd been living in that hell her whole life. They removed her immediately. Richard's hands clenched beneath the table. Do you know what happened to her after? Cole nodded slowly. I heard through the network. Foster care at first, then adoption. Her name got changed, standard procedure for kids, pulled from that kind of situation. Fresh start, new identity. What was her new name? Kristen something. Haley, I think? Family moved a few towns over. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Richard felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear, but certainty. The dog, Richard said carefully. How did he react when they took the girl? Cole's expression darkened. Went absolutely insane. Took 4 men with tranquilizer darts to get him in the transport. And you know what he did the whole time? He was searching. Looking for her. Making this sound I'd never heard before, like he was calling for her. He'd die for that child, Richard said quietly. Without hesitation, Cole confirmed. That little girl was the only decent thing that ever happened to him in that place. She was his whole world. Richard stood, his mind racing. Kristen Haley hadn't performed magic on his lawn. She hadn't tamed an aggressive beast with supernatural gifts. She'd simply come home. And Rocco traumatized. Violent. Uncontrollable. Rocco had recognized the one person who'd shown him kindness when the world was nothing but blood and brutality. His past. His safety. His family. She'd saved him once in a cage. And in his own broken way, Rocco had been waiting 4 years for her to save him again. Richard sat on a park bench 50 yards away, watching Kristen throw a tennis ball, while Rocco bounded after it like a puppy. The transformation was complete. The same dog that had hospitalized 3 trainers now played gently with an 8-year-old girl, carefully moderating his strength, returning the ball to her hands with impossible delicacy. When Kristen stumbled over a tree root, Rocco was there instantly, steadying her with his massive body before she could fall. Sarah Haley sat beside her daughter on a picnic blanket, watching with obvious relief. After Richard had explained the situation, carefully omitting certain details about his business and Rocco's origins, she'd agreed to supervised visits. If it helps him heal, she'd said, then Kristen would want to be part of that. Richard watched Kristen laugh as Rocco licked her face, his enormous tail wagging with pure joy. The sound cut through Richard like a blade. In 20 years of building his empire, he'd commanded absolute loyalty through fear, money, and calculated violence. Men obeyed him because disobedience meant consequences they couldn't afford. His network operated with military precision because everyone understood that Richard Banks rewarded success and eliminated failure. But this effortless devotion, this complete trust, this willingness to transform entirely for someone, he'd never inspired anything close to it. The realization settled over him like a weight heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. What he'd mistaken for loyalty in his organization was simply self-preservation. What he'd called respect was actually fear wearing a professional mask. Kristen hadn't bought Rocco's devotion. She hadn't threatened it into existence. She'd simply been kind when kindness was the rarest thing in the world, and Rocco would die for her without hesitation. Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Humility. the uncomfortable recognition that everything he'd built, every method he'd perfected, every strategy he'd employed, it was all inferior to what an 8-year-old accomplished through compassion. His phone buzzed with messages from his lieutenants, shipments to approve, territory disputes to resolve, the machinery of his empire requiring constant attention. Richard stared at the screen, then looked back at Kristen and Rocco. What was the point of controlling an empire if this simple, genuine connection remained forever beyond his reach? Over the following days, Rocco's behavior shifted dramatically. He'd wait by Richard's front door each morning, ears perked, listening for Kristen's footsteps down the street. He'd track her scent when they walked, always aware of her location. At night, he'd position himself by the window facing her house, standing guard over someone who didn't even know she needed protecting. The dog had found his purpose, and it had nothing to do with Richard. But with that purpose came danger Richard couldn't ignore. Late one night, reviewing security footage from his warehouse, Richard's mind drifted to darker possibilities. His enemies were always searching for leverage, something they could use to hurt him, control him, force concessions. For years, they'd found nothing. Richard kept his personal life sterile, his vulnerabilities hidden. But now there was Kristen. If anyone discovered that an 8-year-old girl could control his dog, that she held influence over something even Richard couldn't manage, she'd become a target. They'd use her to get to him, kidnap her to leverage his operations, hurt her to send him a message. And Rocco, protective as he was, couldn't be everywhere at once. Richard stood abruptly from his desk, his hands shaking slightly, a physical response he hadn't experienced in years. The fragile hope that Kristen represented, the possibility that there was something beyond fear and control, could be destroyed so easily. He could lose the dog. He could lose the girl. He could lose the uncomfortable but necessary questions she'd awakened in him about what kind of man he'd become. Richard walked to his window, staring out at the quiet suburban street where normal families lived normal lives, blissfully unaware of the darkness operating in their midst. For the first time in his criminal career, Richard Banks didn't know what to do, and that terrified him more than any rival ever had. I'd love to know, have you ever had someone or something in your life that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're finding yourself emotionally invested in Richard, Kristen, and Rocco's journey, subscribe and become part of our storytelling family. Now, back to that terrifying night that changed everything. The security alert came at 2:47 a.m. Richard's phone lit up with notifications from the perimeter cameras. 2 vehicles, no headlights, moving slowly down the adjacent street. He recognized the SUVs immediately. The Cortez crew, testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. He was reaching for his gun when Rocco erupted. The Mastiff had been sleeping in the hallway, but suddenly he was on his feet, a deep growl building in his chest that Richard felt through the floorboards. But Rocco wasn't facing the window. He wasn't oriented toward the approaching threat. He was staring at the front door, his entire body rigid with urgency. Rocco, stay. The dog hit the door with his full weight, splintering the frame. Richard cursed and ran after him, expecting Rocco to charge toward the vehicles, to engage the intruders with the violence that had defined his existence. Instead, Rocco ran in the opposite direction, straight toward Kristen's house. Richard's blood turned to ice. He sprinted after the Mastiff, his mind racing through terrible possibilities. Had they already sent someone to the Haley residence? Was this a coordinated attack? How had they even known about Kristen? But when Richard rounded the corner into Kristen's yard, there were no attackers, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Just Kristen, sitting calmly on her back porch in her pajamas, with Rocco positioned protectively at her feet. The girl looked up at Richard with those unnervingly calm gray eyes, completely unafraid despite the chaos of a massive dog crashing into her yard in the middle of the night. "He was afraid you were in trouble," she said softly, stroking Rocco's head. Richard stopped, his chest heaving, his gun still in his hand. Behind him, he could hear the SUVs accelerating away. The Cortez crew had spotted him running and decided tonight wasn't worth the confrontation. But Richard barely registered their departure. He was staring at Rocco, who'd sensed danger and run not toward it, but toward the one thing worth protecting. Not Richard, not the house, not the empire or the territory or anything Richard had built. Kristen. Sarah appeared at the back door, clutching a robe. "What's happening? Kristen, get inside." "It's okay, Mom," Kristen said calmly. He just got scared. Richard lowered his weapon slowly, something breaking open inside his chest. For the first time in 20 years, maybe longer, Richard Banks knelt. Not in dominance, not in strategy, in genuine, humbling surrender to something he couldn't control or manipulate. How did you do it? He asked quietly, his voice rough. How did you reach him when no one else could? Kristen tilted her head, considering the question with a child's simple wisdom. I didn't do anything special, she said. Someone was very kind to him once, when he was scared and hurt. I think he remembered. She spoke without awareness, without understanding the full weight of her words. She didn't know she was that someone. Didn't remember the cages or the blood or the nights she'd risked beatings to bring comfort to a broken animal. But Richard knew. He understood what Kristen couldn't, that she hadn't tamed Rocco in his suburban yard. She'd saved him 4 years ago in hell, and Rocco's damaged mind had never forgotten. Every act of violence, every moment of uncontrollable rage, every trainer who'd failed it had all been Rocco searching for the one person who'd shown him that the world could be gentle. And when he'd finally found her again, everything else had fallen away. She was you, Richard whispered, so quietly that only Rocco could hear. She's always been you. Rocco leaned against Kristen's legs, his massive body finally at peace. The girl wrapped her small arms around his neck, and the monster who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood melted into her embrace like he'd come home after a lifetime of wandering. Richard stood slowly, holstering his weapon. Sarah watched him warily from the doorway, protective of her daughter but beginning to understand that something profound had happened here, something that transcended danger or territory or the violence that usually defined Richard's world. Thank you, Richard said to Kristen, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name, for saving him, then and now. Kristen smiled, innocent and unknowing. He's a good dog. He just needed someone to remember that. Richard nodded, unable to speak, and walked back toward his house. Behind him, a little girl and a broken dog sat together in the darkness, proof that the strongest bonds weren't built on power. They were built on the memory of kindness, when kindness was all that mattered. Richard arrived at the Haley residence the following morning with coffee and an envelope. Sarah answered the door cautiously, but invited him to her kitchen table. Kristen was at school, and the house felt strangely quiet without her calming presence. I need to explain some things, Richard began, choosing his words carefully. About Rocco, about where he came from. He told her everything, the dog-fighting ring, the rescue raid, the little girl who'd shown kindness to a tortured animal. He watched Sarah's face cycle through shock, horror, and finally understanding as the pieces connected. Kristen doesn't remember, Sarah said quietly, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. The trauma. The therapist said her mind protected her by blocking most of it out. Maybe that's better, Richard said. But Rocco remembers, and he'll never hurt her. I'd stake my life on it. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You're not just a quiet neighbor, are you? No, Richard admitted. I'm not, which is why I need you to take this. He slid the envelope across the table. Inside were documents, a trust fund in Kristen's name, security contacts, resources Sarah could access if she ever needed protection. I don't want your money, Sarah said firmly. It's not about money, Richard replied. It's about keeping her safe, because she saved something I thought was beyond saving. And that means something. Sarah didn't take the envelope, but she didn't push it back either. She can keep visiting him, she said finally. But if I ever think she's in danger, you won't, Richard promised. I'll make sure of it. Over the following weeks, Kristen became a regular presence at Richard's home. She'd arrive after school, and Rocco would be waiting at the door, his tail wagging with pure joy. They'd play in the yard while Richard watched from his study window, seeing a version of his dog he'd never imagined possible. The transformation wasn't just in Rocco. Richard began restructuring his operations, making changes that surprised his lieutenants. He started rewarding loyalty with genuine respect rather than just money. He listened more, intimidated less. When a lower-level operator made a mistake, Richard offered correction instead of elimination. You're going soft, Marcus observed one evening, though his tone held more curiosity than criticism. No, Richard said, watching Kristen through the window as she read to Rocco in the garden. I'm just learning the difference between fear and loyalty. One lasts as long as the threat. The other. He paused. The other lasts 4 years in hell and still comes running when it hears a familiar voice. Marcus followed his gaze and said nothing more. 3 months after that first impossible moment on his lawn, Richard stood in his backyard watching a scene that mirrored the beginning, but everything had changed. Kristen knelt in the grass, her small hands stroking Rocco's scarred head. The massive mastiff sat beside her, peaceful and content, his dangerous past visible in his scars but no longer defining his present. Neighbors walked by without fear now, some even waving. The Mitchells had stopped crossing the street. Mrs. Chen's cat occasionally wandered into the yard, and Rocco simply watched it pass with mild interest. Richard stood behind them, no longer hiding his awe, no longer ashamed of the vulnerability this little girl had exposed in him. I commanded an empire built on fear, he thought, watching Kristen laugh as Rocco gently nuzzled her shoulder. I believed power came from control, from making people afraid of what I could do to them. But a little girl taught me that true power comes from love. She didn't tame a monster. She reminded him he was never a monster at all, just broken, just waiting for someone to remember he was worth saving. Kristen looked back at Richard and smiled innocent, unaware of the profound change she'd sparked in a man who'd spent 20 years believing compassion was weakness. Mr. Banks, want to throw the ball with us? Richard hesitated, then walked forward and knelt in the grass beside them. Rocco leaned against him, not in aggression, not in dominance, but in simple trust. The kind of trust that couldn't be bought or threatened into existence. The kind that had to be earned through something Richard was only beginning to understand. Yeah, Richard said softly, taking the tennis ball from Kristen's hand. I'd like that. As the afternoon sun cast golden light across the yard, a ruthless crime boss, a traumatized dog, and a gentle-hearted little girl sat together in the grass. And for the first time, in longer than Richard could remember, something that felt like peace settled over the Banks estate. Rocco was healed. Kristen was safe. And Richard Banks, one of the most feared men in the Midwest, was forever changed by the simple truth that the strongest bonds aren't forged in fire. They're forged in kindness, remembered across time, waiting patiently to be recognized, waiting, always, to come home. Stories like this remind me why I do what I do, finding tales of unexpected transformation that prove love is stronger than fear. If you felt something watching Richard's journey, hit subscribe and join thousands of others who believe in the power of compassion. Drop a comment telling me what moment hit you hardest. Now, let's see how Richard, Kristen, and Rocco's story concludes.